Hello and welcome to Picture This, a podcast from the photo archives of the Albuquerque Museum. My name is Jill Hartke, and I'm the digital archivist here at the museum. Today we are tagging along with volunteer firefighters as they take on Albuquerque's greatest fire disaster of the 19th century. In the photo archives of the Albuquerque Museum is a photograph of the Grant building on fire. A crowd watches as firemen use water hoses to douse the flames. Here's the story behind the photograph. By 1898, Albuquerque had at least 4 volunteer fire companies: Hose Companies 2 and 3, Ferguson Hook and Ladder Company, and Scott Moore Hose Company. These companies were based upon a popular model of volunteer firefighting that began under the stewardship of Benjamin Franklin in Philadelphia in 1736. Franklin's volunteer firefighting model was small, with no more than 30 volunteers per company, and each company was self-governed and self-financed. The self-financing part meant that volunteer firefighters tended to be men who were merchants or wealthy tradesmen because they could afford to pool their money to purchase things like fire buckets, fire hoses, carts, and wagons. Also, if a volunteer firefighter missed a meeting or did not respond to a fire alarm, they would be fined, and wealthier men could afford to pay those fines. Some of the most famous names in American history are also some of the most famous names in firefighting history. George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, John Hancock, and of course Ben Franklin all served as volunteer firefighters. In Albuquerque, volunteer firefighting was an important defense in the 1890s when the city was seeing a boom in building and businesses near the railroad depot and heading eastward into the Huning Highlands. Albuquerque's new town was vulnerable to fire damage. Many buildings were wooden, and desert winds could whip up a smoldering ember, and fire might quickly overtake an entire block of buildings. Many Albuquerque citizens had arrived from larger cities like Chicago or Boston, where fires had fundamentally altered the urban landscape. Churches, houses, landmark buildings, they burned completely to the ground, not to mention the loss of lives and livelihoods. The people of Albuquerque knew that if they weren't careful, their new city could go up in smoke. By 1898, the city of Albuquerque had 10,000 people and 75 volunteer firefighters. Volunteer fire companies were busy, sometimes working several fires in a single day with limited equipment. Altogether, the companies had 2 hose carts, 1 hook and ladder truck, 2,000 feet of water hose, and, if needed, they could request an additional 500 feet of water hose from the rail yards. They had horses to help pull those carts, but because hitching the equipment to the horses was time-consuming, the carts were often wheeled to the fire by the volunteers themselves. The Grant Building was an Albuquerque landmark at 3rd Street and Railroad Avenue. It was built in 1881, making it one of the earliest buildings in Newtown. The Sanborn Fire insurance maps show that it was a 2-story building made mostly of brick, but the upper floor held the Grant Opera House, which consisted of a wooden stage, scenery, and footlights. There were also offices on the 2nd floor, occupied by lawyers, real estate agents, and insurance brokers. The ground floor was taken up almost entirely by Ilfeld Brothers Mercantile, the largest general store in the territory, according to the Albuquerque Journal. Across an alley in the back of the building was Mrs. Albright's Art Parlor, one of the most successful photography studios in the area. And in a newer addition to the Grant Building, there was a millinery shop. Around 9 a.m. on Sunday, June 19, 1898, Felipe Gutierrez, a cook for Colonel J.G. Albright, was working in the building that housed Mrs. Albright's Art Parlor. He looked out a window across the alley and saw smoke coming from the 2nd floor of the Grant Building near the Opera House stage. He yelled for a boarder in the house, Mr. C.W. Anderson, to run and sound the fire alarm. As Mr. Anderson ran out of the building shouting for the fire alarm, a young boy heard, and he reached the community fire bell first and raised the alarm. That alarm at that time sounded like the call of a mockingbird. Bernard Ruppy, the volunteer fire marshal, was working at his Cosmopolitan Pharmacy, which was 1 block east of the Grant Building on Railroad Avenue. He heard the mockingbird call and he rushed to pull the official fire alarm box to alert all volunteer companies to respond. By the time the volunteer firefighters arrived at 3rd Street and Railroad Avenue with their carts and water hoses, smoke was billowing from the back of the 2nd story of the building, but no flames were visible. The firemen rushed into the building and broke through the Opera House doors on the 2nd floor, seeing the stage and scenery engulfed in flames. They used 8 water hoses to spray the flames, but with so many different water hoses being used, the water pressure began to fail. As the flames grew, the firemen had to accept that the fire was burning out of control. The question switched from how do we save this building to what can we save from this building? Ilfeld Brothers Mercantile on the ground floor held storerooms full of silks, dresses, carpets, and more. These were highly flammable materials, and the storerooms might have been a good place to begin removing items from the burning building. But instead, a tenant whose office was on the second floor persuaded the firemen that the books and papers within his office needed to be saved first. Soon, law books and legal papers were being flung from the upper floor to a gathering crowd below. People scooped up the items and dumped them into a wagon, which was carted away in absolute confusion. After saving the books and papers from one office, the growing crowd became enthusiastic to save whatever they could. The firemen were attempting to carefully bring down larger items from the second floor, but bystanders rushed into the building and took a different strategy, throwing wooden desks and light furniture from the upper story windows, which shattered into wooden shards across the sidewalk. In the ensuing chaos, there was an incredible find reported in the newspaper. Tucked into a realtor's office on the second floor of the Grant building were 2 cannons. They were identified as 2 of the famous Civil War cannons that had been exhumed several years earlier in Old Town. The cannons were not thrown out of the upper story windows, but safely brought out of the burning building. As an aside, Albuquerque was given 4 of the 8 cannons that were exhumed from Old Town, but there are only 2 remaining because 2 of those cannons went missing. Whether these 2 that were saved from the Grant Opera House fire were the ones that went missing or are the 2 that remain in the city is unclear. But back to the fire at hand. A fire of this magnitude, while disastrous, was clearly a community event. The Women's Christian Temperance Union brought buckets of coffee for the firefighters and bystanders to enjoy while watching the spectacle. The police marshal had his hands full, not only trying to assist in fighting the fire, but drunken men kept wandering out of nearby saloons, getting in the way and generally causing a scene, to the point that the fire marshal had to arrest several of them to keep the men from getting hurt or adding to the chaos. Several of the surrounding stores, including Mrs. Albright's art parlor and that millinery shop next door, sustained damage as people were hurrying about trying to remove things from their shops and buildings in case the fire spread. By 10:30 a.m., 90 minutes after that first alarm was sounded, the flames had reached the front of the Grant building. And a half an hour later, at 11 a.m., the floor of the Opera House gave way. Crashing tremendously into the storerooms of Ilfeld Brothers Mercantile, where only a small amount of stock had been recovered. Despite the total collapse of the building's second story, no firefighters or bystanders were seriously injured, although many were bruised. The newspaper reported that William H. Cobb, a photographer from Cobb's studio and a veteran volunteer firefighter, was hurt by falling timber, and a bystander was hit on the head by a flying nozzle from a fire hose. But otherwise, people were relatively unscathed. The fire was put out by the firemen on Sunday, but embers continued to burn overnight, sometimes igniting smoldering fires that attentive night watchmen put out. The fire's cause remained unclear. Chief Rupee believed the fire began beneath the stage, and the first smoke that was sighted by Felipe Gutierrez was in the area of the stage. The Opera House had had its final recital a week earlier, and the entire stage and auditorium area had been cleaned and shut for the summer, leading to confusion about what could have even been in the room or under the stage to start the fire, because no electricity was live, and there were no papers lying around. It was a conundrum and made for lively discussion throughout the following days. Reporters lauded the firemen, saying other stores in the vicinity stand today as monuments attesting the fact that our volunteer fire department did all that men could do, poorly equipped as they are, to save other people's property and save this young city from an irreparable injury. The neighboring buildings were saved, but the Grant building was a total loss. It was estimated to be worth $60,000 in 1898, which is about $2.1 million today. But the stock within the Ilfeld Brothers storerooms was estimated to be worth over $125,000, which is nearly $4.5 million today. Ilfeld Brothers carried insurance on their goods, but not enough to cover the full extent of their loss. They moved immediately into the Armijo building, which was across the street, and advertised fire sales for weeks. Of the lawyers, realtors, and insurance men on the second floor of the Grant building, whose goods were thrown from the windows in attempts to save them, all of them were covered by insurance, except, interestingly, the insurance man himself. Over the next couple of years, the volunteer fire companies continued to fight fires, but the city grew at a rate that made volunteer firefighting nearly impossible. In 1900, the companies in Albuquerque voted to reorganize under the leadership of Bernard Ruppy, who had retired from firefighting but was persuaded to take on the task of helping Albuquerque develop a city-operated fire department. Ruppy said that the Albuquerque Fire Department had a reputation for being the best in the West, but that the city needed a more robust system of protection for businesses and residents. Ruppy asked the city to pay 2 men at least $60 a month to be constantly at the fire station, and that up to 25 of the volunteers who wished to remain as firemen would be paid $40 a year. The plan also requested new equipment, a better firehouse, better stables for the horses, and equipment that could quickly be hitched. On June 7, 1900, the resolution to abolish the volunteer fire companies was adopted, and the Albuquerque Fire Department was officially created, with Bernard Ruppy as the city's first official fire chief. Many cities in the 20th century created city and county-supported fire departments, but volunteer firefighting, while dwindling, is still alive and well. 287 years after Benjamin Franklin began the first community volunteer fire company, there are more than 1 million active firefighters in the United States, and over half of them are volunteers. In New Mexico, over 75% of the 248 fire departments that are registered with the National Fire Department Registry are completely volunteer. Thank you for joining us for Picture This with the Albuquerque Museum. Please join us next time for the story behind another photograph in the museum's collection.